this video continues from the previous. And here you can see eye level the roof that we saw from underneath. And I was just looking at this, and it looks like if the rain hit, it would go through and be diverted by these lips that are around this, so they wouldn't go through the... So he did solve that problem, fortunately. Though it could be cool if this overhang were wide enough and you had like this ridge around here that was maybe like a little moat. And if it did rain in a place like this where it's mostly never rains, and it did rain through that into that fountain, moat, whatever you want to call it, river, that would be cool. But okay, that's not how it was designed. So you can see elements from the styles around him. I mean, you definitely see craftsmen. And then there are Art Nouveau elements, there are Art Deco elements, there are other types of elements that he was influenced by, because I'll show you in a minute. He was also influenced by Egyptian architecture and other styles, Mayan architecture. And so you can see them, but he took it to a different level. It's sort of like, you know, how you have analogy would just be like how you have a wolf, but then you have all these different looking dogs, and the dogs are derivatives of wolves, and that's what begins to happen, right? With some of the styles, you see that they become pulled away from. But his work was by no means derivative. It was still beautiful and original, and it was based on principles and elements of design, and then he just started going in his own direction and never looked back. So he designed 362 houses that were built. About 16 years ago, only 300 of them were left. We had one lost in Katrina. Some are just really small, and they're older, and just happens. Passage of time, people not caring for their homes properly, and despite the fact that he was a civil engineer in college, there were structural issues with a lot of his buildings. And we'll talk more about that. I know I've given you a little bit of that. We'll talk more about that when we get to Falling Water. And then a lot of his bigger pieces are preserved as museum pieces. And then here is a restoration plan, because this was not his work. He didn't have CAD. You could see this is Historic American Building Society. They did some retrofit. And you can see here, look, that looks very Art Nouveau, doesn't it? But yet not Art Nouveau. And so that's one of the things that is very different about Prairie style, is that it's similar but different. It's the same but different. The Fountainhead is a book that all architecture students talk about and many read. I read it. I wanted to know what people were talking about. Ayn Rand supposedly had an affair with Frank Lloyd Wright and wrote her character Howard Rourke based on him. Of course, she denies it because he was married, and I don't know what he did, but it's an interesting perspective if it's true, and it fits his character, his personality. So if she didn't base it on her knowledge or her personal relationship with him, then she certainly was influenced by him for the book. And so one of his sons became an architect, and one of his grandsons became an architect. And so this is a building designed by his son, Lloyd Wright. Some more of his futuristic sketches. Makes you wonder how somebody who built so prolifically had time for fantasy, but he did. And that's what we talk about. We talk about how all designers have side projects. And it's something you should have, because here's why. You're always going to have restrictions when you're working for other people. You're going to be doing their work. And sometimes to help with creativity, you want to be able to do things to explore and to experiment and get outside the box. And I mean, I just think that tower's beautiful. I would have loved to have seen something like that built. I mean, we do have some things like that now. It's very futuristic. Of course, we don't have these flying pods yet, but who knows? Okay, so he is the first architect to have given us the open floor plan and house. Prior to him, every floor plan we've looked at, rooms were segregated. And partly that was done for structural reasons. But as we have gotten into the modern era where we can span, we have the means to produce and supply building materials that can hold up larger expanses of a room, he was able to start removing walls and start opening them up. And this is what he said. This is him, and this was considered progressive in his time. This allowed the woman of the house to work in her workplace, as he often called the kitchen, yet keep track of and be available for the children and or guests in the dining room. Much of modern architecture can be traced back to Wright's designs. And however you may feel about that, politically, he did create something that was useful to people who stayed at home or worked at home or wanted more connection amongst the family, so that it wasn't mom hiding behind the scenes working in the kitchen and not able to interact with her guests. So he gave us that. And there he is in his studio near the end of his life. He lived to be very old. I think he was 92. Okay, this is the Martin House, and you can see that he used very large overhangs on his buildings. And one of the reasons this was ingenious was not just from a sustainable perspective, which we'll talk about when we get to sustainable design course, but it also caused all the light that came in the house to be indirect. And diffused light is just, it's beautiful. Direct light is harsh and glaring, but bounced light, diffused light, and especially when it's hitting these caramel colored surfaces, is one of the reasons that his interior spaces are just so divine. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it other than you have to, at some point, take a road trip and go visit one of his houses. And unfortunately, they don't make it cheap to get into these things. But it really is something I think is very important for someone who is a student of architecture to see. Okay, so he designed this over the course of 2 years, and it's considered one of his most important projects in the Prairie style. And a scholar said, Robert McCarter, it can be argued that the Martin House complex is the most important design of the first half of Wright's career, matched only by Falling Water over 30 years later. Look at that. I mean, it's just staggeringly beautiful on every level. I mean, he just had this eye and mind that worked both on a big picture level and on a detail level in ways that most people's don't. And it's a rare thing that someone can do that. And it's like he was, I will often refer to architecture as sculpture. It's functional sculpture. And here he made it very much so. And just look at the beauty in all this. I mean, he's got these stained glass is this incredible detail. It's geometric Art Nouveau, right? All of this. Also, there's an Art Deco feel to it, but yet it's also his own. And look, there you go. There's repetition. And leading lines. Look, we can just see those leading lines right to the sculpture. His negative space was all thought out. Look, no matter where you look out these windows, you get a nice view. There's not anything terrible in any of these views. I just can imagine living in a house like this. It must have been very nurturing. And this is someone created a massing, so you can see all the different parts and pieces that he did without the aid of a computer. And it was a complex. I mean, this is a hallway. This is the one we just looked at with the colonnades, from the living, the main public spaces in the building, and then these are the more private spaces. And you could see the hand-drawn floor plan. Oh, he also had a gardener's cottage. And so Martin, the owner of the house, was disappointed with the small conservatory. So he had a 60-foot long greenhouse constructed. And the greenhouse was not designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright came in and said he wanted to come in and put a little architecture on it. And Mr. Martin apparently had enough of Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright because he was very difficult to work with. He only made a living doing this because his work was so good that people were willing to tolerate how rude he was. I'm telling you, I've read letters that he's written to clients. It just blew my mind. I would never speak to somebody that way. We used to make fun of them when I was an architecture student. He would consider the Martin House his opus and called it the complex that was close to a perfect composition. And it's hard to argue with him. I mean, you look at this and try to find something you would change, and you just can't, because he followed the principles and elements beautifully. And when he broke them the right way. Not a lot of breaking, though. He pretty much followed them. They designed all this furniture, and you look at this and you can see there's that craftsman influence, but not craftsman. And you can see it, stained glass. And here's a panel up close. And a chair he designed. I love that chair. This thing is beautiful. Okay, we're going to stop this one here and we'll continue in the next.